of course, speaking after Adam, so much has been said that it's difficult to think of a new angle, but certainly let me very much share with him the last point he made on the importance of standing up for the values that we believe in. I do think that indeed, if the United States does not change course, and we can debate how much it is changing course already, but if it's sort of sticking to what President Trump has initially run an agenda on, then certainly the responsibility for Europe and Asia, I'm saying this here in Tokyo, in Yokohama, I think the responsibility for Europe and Asia to jointly work on sustaining the multilateral trading system, the multilateral, not just trading system, but also multilateral climate system, is of absolutely fundamental importance. I think together there can be actually quite a bit of the multilateral system salvaged, even if the United States was to defect. And I think that's perhaps something we can afterwards debate in this panel, because perhaps let me give you just one short example on from the area of climate change. If one big guy deviates from sticking to the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, so if the United States was to completely deviate, but all the others still stick to it, we could still have a significant influence on the speed of climate change. Now, if we think that, well, now that the US is skipping away, we are following suit and do the same thing, then basically the climate change deal is dead and things look very quickly very ugly. So I do think the case for cooperation stays even after the United States has defected. Now, what I wanted to do is talk about some of the challenges of globalization, and perhaps first trigger with you the notion that globalization in terms of trade and financial flows, despite all the rhetorics in some of the advanced economies that we've seen in the UK and in the United States, is actually still well and alive. And to show this point, let me show you a number of charts that demonstrate that global imports as a share of GDP are not falling. I mean, it's not true to think that we are at a stage where globalization is reversing. Not yet. I mean, it's slowing down, but it's not yet reversing. Let me also show you financial interconnectedness. This is global cross-border investment, so world financial accounts. And you see that, of course, the speed of investment cross borders has been falling, but it's not negative. I mean, there was a very short period in the 2008 to 10 period, 2009 and 10 essentially, where we had a significant negative, so retraction behind borders, but it is still very much positive. So we are here in territory where global investment, so investment across border measured in global GDP, is still at around 2% of GDP, world GDP. So interconnectedness, global interconnectedness, is actually still increasing. Let me go back to my my initial slides. Now, I think, of course, the case for globalization has been very much criticized, in particular in the Western world, in particular in the United States and in the United Kingdom. I interpret the vote, the Brexit vote, also as a vote against the notion that the UK wants to share its sovereignty in a globally integrated framework, in the European integrated framework. And so this is certainly an outcome that is very strongly influenced by the notion in Western economies, especially in those two countries, that globalization is to be blamed for all the evils in this world, and in particular for the white middle class suffering and having a tougher time advancing and losing in relative terms to the rest, to their peers and to other parts of society. And if you look at indicators, economic indicators such as income inequality indicators or the labor share, so income going to labor, you indeed see a pretty consistent trend across many countries of a falling labor income share for many, many decades now. That is actually a pretty long trend. And you also see that the manufacturing sector, so the traditional old industrial base, the steel industry and so on, but also manufacturing, car producers and so on, have been losing in relative terms relative to the rest of the economies in a number of Western countries. So this is a pretty universal trend. If you look at income inequality, what you would see is that income inequality is of course rising in some countries, but in fact the rise is much more pronounced in the United States and in the UK than in much of continental Europe, where income inequality is actually relatively stable. So it's not true that there's a massive rise in income inequality. So do we see here, and that's perhaps my provocative question, will we be seeing a shift between and a rift between the US and the UK on the one side in the industrial advanced economies and the continental European economies on the other side? And with continental European economies, let me push a little bit also the so-called Rhineland model, so the German economic model, where you have a very strong social system, a very strong welfare system, but you combine that with actually very different kind of labor market policies, regional policies that help sustain industry and therefore prevent concentration and rising polarization of our labor markets. So are we seeing this rift? Well, I think it's too early to say, and certainly we are not yet over the French elections. And as you know, we are all hopeful, of course, but we are still in a world where we may get a neo-fascist in the Élysée in Paris. So I think it's certainly too early to declare victory, and it's certainly too early to think that all these economic factors are the most important and most determining factor for the stability of our countries and the stability for the traditional liberal value-based system. So I think the economics matters, but I want to show you one slide to show that perhaps the issue goes really much beyond economics and may actually be much more about cultural issues or identity issues that have to be looked at. And to show that, I took this slide from a blog from London School of Economics by Eric Kaufman, Trump and Brexit, Why It's Again Not the Economist Stupid. And I found this really a very striking chart produced by a survey, YouGov survey, that found that in fact the economics, so whether the level of family income is not the most significant, most important determinant of whether you voted for Trump or not in the United States. So what it shows here is that a much more significant determinant of the vote for Donald Trump was the fact whether you believe in authoritarian values or not. And the way they capture this in this survey is by asking the very innocent question to the survey respondents of whether they think the most important quality of a child should be to be considerate or to be well behaved. And by capturing that answer, that's a sociological trick that they've been using, they capture to what extent they believe in authority and they believe in order or not. And so what this shows is that actually these kind of beliefs are extremely important determine whether or not you vote for someone like Donald Trump. And so I think the issue is much more significant than the differences here in the family income that you see. So arguably, this is really important to look well beyond the economics and to think about values, cultural values, and societal values, because those are very important determinants of the votes and the politics in our economies. Now, perhaps to conclude, also being mindful of the time, I think there is basically this policy discussion, which is, I think, too narrow, but it's still the dominant policy discussion about how do we deal with the challenges to globalization. On the one hand, we promise to rewrite the rules of the game, protect the way life has always been, and resist change. So that's the Trumpian approach, versus let's focus on compensating the losers of globalization and manage change. That's perhaps the continental welfare system. I think that debate is probably too narrow, because things have gone beyond economics and cover issues, as I wanted to argue, such as cultural factors. So I think perhaps a useful, and that's my last slide, a useful way of thinking about how we as think tanks can deal with all of this is of course to start off, and I think Adam very eloquently put it, what are the different things we can do as think tanks. We provide the data and analysis, we interact with policymakers, we fact check, we shape high-level public debates. But I guess the one question I would ask is whether we are, as think tanks, actually reaching the right audiences. And I guess the way to think about this is that if we think that these cultural issues are the most important determinant for, or one of the most important determinants for the skepticism towards globalization, we should ask whether we actually reach the people that vote that way, that have a very different view on these issues. And perhaps let me close with a word by Robert K. Merton, the American sociologist, that found that communities are now very much split between the so-called locals and the so-called cosmopolitans. And most of our policies and most of us probably reach much more the cosmopolitans. I mean, being here in Yokohama at a global think tank summit is basically the summit of the cosmopolitans, so we talk to each other. But do we talk enough to the locals, to those that have a different kind of view and that perhaps believe in communities as the main safeguard against all the external forces of globalization and so on. So I guess my plea would be to think about how do we shape our audiences and how do we reach the right audiences, and perhaps the right audiences is increasingly the locals and less the cosmopolitans. Thank you very much.